The wind howled across the Yorkshire moors as Eleanor Hartwell clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. The year was 1847, and winter had arrived early to the English countryside, bringing with it a harsh reminder of her family's desperate circumstances. Through the frost-covered window of their crumbling cottage, she watched the grand carriages roll past on the distant road, their occupants warm and safe behind velvet curtains, while she counted the last precious coins in their nearly empty jar. "Ellie, my dear child," her father's weak voice called from his sickbed in the corner. Thomas Hartwell had once been the village blacksmith, respected and prosperous, until a terrible accident left him unable to work. Now tuberculosis ravaged his lungs, and the local physician demanded payment they simply didn't have. "I fear I've failed you and your mother." Eleanor knelt beside him, forcing a brave smile despite the tears threatening to spill. "Don't speak such nonsense, Papa. You've given us everything, your love, your strength, your wisdom. That's worth more than all the gold in England." But even as she spoke these comforting words, her heart ached with the knowledge that love alone wouldn't pay their mounting debts or buy the medicine that might save his life. Her mother, Margaret, entered carrying a bowl of thin gruel, their only meal of the day. The worry lines etched deep in her once beautiful face told the story of their gradual descent from modest comfort to grinding poverty. "Mrs. Pemberton came by again," she whispered, not wanting Thomas to hear. "She's demanding we settle the rent by week's end," or she couldn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Eviction meant certain death in the brutal winter months ahead. That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She had heard whispers in the village about the Duke of Whitmore, the enigmatic nobleman who owned vast estates throughout the county. Some called him cold and ruthless, others whispered of tragedies that had hardened his heart, but everyone agreed he was impossibly wealthy, and that he occasionally hired servants from the local villages. Against her parents' wishes, Eleanor wrapped herself in her mother's old cloak and ventured out into the storm. The path to Whitmore Hall was treacherous, winding through dense woods and up steep hillsides. With each step, doubt crept into her mind. What could she, a simple blacksmith's daughter, possibly offer to such a powerful man? But the image of her father's labored breathing drove her forward through the biting wind and swirling snow. The great house loomed before her like something from a fairy tale, its countless windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. She had never seen anything so magnificent or so intimidating. The butler who answered her timid knock looked down at her with obvious disdain, taking in her shabby clothes and desperate appearance. "Servant's entrance is around back, girl, though I doubt his grace has need of your services." "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "I only seek honest work to help my dying father. I'll do anything. Scrub floors, tend fires, work in the kitchens. I'm not afraid of hard labor." The butler's expression softened slightly at her obvious sincerity, but before he could respond, a deep voice echoed from within the grand foyer. "Who calls at such an hour, Morrison?" The Duke of Whitmore himself appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. He was younger than she had expected, though his steel-blue eyes held a weariness that seemed far beyond his years. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, before his features hardened into the mask of aristocratic indifference. Their eyes met across the threshold, and for a moment neither spoke. Then the wind gusted violently, threatening to tear the cloak from Eleanor's shoulders, and she stumbled forward involuntarily. Duke Alexander Whitmore caught Eleanor's arm as she stumbled, his strong grip preventing her from falling on the marble steps. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. It had been so long since he had touched another human being with anything approaching gentleness. "Careful, miss," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "These steps become treacherous in such weather." Eleanor found herself staring up into those storm-grey eyes, momentarily forgetting why she had come. There was something haunting in his gaze, a profound sadness that reminded her of winter landscapes, beautiful but utterly desolate. "Your Grace," she managed to whisper, remembering her manners and attempting a curtsy despite her trembling legs. "I apologize for disturbing your evening. I am Eleanor Hartwell, and I've come seeking employment." "Hartwell," Alexander repeated slowly, recognition flickering across his features. "You're Thomas Hartwell's daughter, the blacksmith who was injured at my father's forge." The admission hung heavy in the cold air between them. The previous duke had been notorious for his neglect of worker safety, and Alexander had spent the 5 years since inheriting the title trying to atone for his father's sins. "Morrison, see that Miss Hartwell is given warm clothes and a proper meal. We'll speak in my study." The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, fussed over Eleanor like a mother hen, wrapping her in warm wool and pressing hot tea into her frozen hands. But the other servants whispered among themselves, shooting curious and sometimes hostile glances her way. "Another charity case," muttered Sarah, the head housemaid. "His Grace has too soft a heart for beggars." Eleanor pretended not to hear, but each word cut deep. She had never been anyone's charity case before. An hour later, dressed in a simple but clean servant's dress, Eleanor stood before the massive oak desk in the Duke's private study. The room was magnificent, yet melancholy, filled with leather-bound books and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Alexander sat silhouetted against the firelight, a glass of brandy in his hand, looking every inch the powerful nobleman he was born to be. "Your father's accident was unfortunate," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "My estate manager assures me that proper compensation was paid, but clearly it wasn't sufficient for medical expenses." He studied her face as he spoke, noting the proud set of her shoulders despite her obvious desperation. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what skills do you possess?" "I can read and write, Your Grace. My father insisted on educating me properly. I'm skilled with numbers and household management, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word. "I don't seek charity, only the opportunity to earn honest wages to help my family." Something in her earnest dignity touched a chord in Alexander's carefully guarded heart. It had been years since anyone in his life had spoken of anything beyond wealth, status, or political advantage. Here was someone who asked for nothing more than the chance to work for what she needed. "Very well, you may serve as my personal secretary. The position pays well, but the work is demanding, and you'll face scrutiny from others in the household." Over the following weeks, Eleanor proved herself invaluable. She organized Alexander's correspondence with remarkable efficiency, managed his social calendar, and even offered thoughtful insights on estate matters. But her presence in the great house stirred resentment among the established servants, who saw her rapid rise as an affront to the natural order. Mrs. Pembroke, the head housekeeper, made her displeasure clear at every opportunity. "She puts on airs above her station," Mrs. Pembroke complained loudly within Eleanor's hearing, "working so closely with His Grace, wearing borrowed finery, acting like she belongs in society drawing rooms. Some people never learn their proper place." Eleanor bore these slights in silence, knowing that any response would only fuel more gossip, but it was Alexander himself who proved the greatest challenge. As days passed, she found herself drawn to the man behind the ducal mask, the one who sat up late reading philosophy, who quietly donated enormous sums to local charities, who still grieved for his younger sister's tragic death 3 years prior. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression of longing so profound it took her breath away. The dangerous attraction between them was becoming impossible to ignore. The revelation came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning when Eleanor was organizing correspondence in Alexander's study. Among the stack of letters was one bearing an official seal she didn't recognize, older correspondence that had somehow been misfiled. As she attempted to sort it properly, the parchment unfolded, revealing her father's name in elegant script. With trembling hands, she read the letter dated 6 months before Thomas Hartwell's accident. It was from the previous Duke, Alexander's father, acknowledging serious safety violations at the forge and promising immediate repairs. But below that, in different handwriting, was a note from the estate manager. "Repairs deemed too costly. Inform His Grace that temporary measures will suffice." The letter had been deliberately intercepted and hidden. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears of rage and disbelief. Her father's devastating accident hadn't been fate or misfortune. It had been preventable, the result of conscious negligence by men who valued profit over human life. The compensation they'd received was guilt money, a pittance compared to what justice demanded. Her family's suffering, their descent into poverty, her father's slow death from untreated injuries, all of it could have been avoided. "Miss Hartwell?" Alexander's voice came from the doorway. "You look distressed. Has something happened?" He approached his desk, noting the scattered papers in her hands, and his expression grew wary. "What have you found?" Eleanor looked up at him through tears, seeing not the man who had shown her kindness, but the heir to a legacy of callous disregard for human life. "Did you know?" she whispered, her voice breaking. About the safety violations. About your estate manager's decision to ignore them. Did you know my father was maimed because repairs were too costly? Alexander's face went ashen as he snatched the letter from her hands, his eyes rapidly scanning the damning evidence. Eleanor, you must understand, this was before I inherited the title. My father's ways, his manager's decisions, none of this was done with my knowledge or consent. But even as he spoke, he could see the trust dying in her beautiful green eyes. Your family's wealth, this grand house, the luxury you take for granted, it's all built on the suffering of people like my father, she said, standing on shaking legs. How many other families have been destroyed for your convenience? How many other daughters have watched their fathers waste away because ducal profits mattered more than human lives? Eleanor, please. Alexander reached for her, but she stepped back as if his touch might burn her. I've been such a fool, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Grateful for scraps from your table, charmed by your kindness, when all along you've been living off blood money. The wages you pay me, the medicine I've been able to buy for Papa, it all comes from wealth stolen from families just like mine. The accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had spent 5 years trying to reform his estate's practices, compensating victims of his father's greed, rebuilding relationships with tenant families. But faced with Eleanor's justified fury, all his efforts seemed hollow, insufficient. You're right to be angry, he said quietly. But please don't let my family's past sins destroy what we could have together. Together? Eleanor laughed bitterly. You're a duke, and I'm the daughter of a man your family crippled. There can never be anything between us but the weight of that injustice. She moved toward the door, her decision made. I'll be gone from this house within the hour. I cannot take another penny of your cursed money. Eleanor, wait. Alexander's composure finally cracked. You can't simply leave. Your father needs medical care, your family needs support. Let me help them properly, not as charity, but as restitution for wrongs that should never have been done. She paused at the threshold, not turning around. Guilt money will never heal my father's broken body or restore my family's honor. Some damages cannot be repaired with coins, Your Grace. And with that she was gone, leaving Alexander alone with the evidence of his family's sins and the devastating realization that he had lost the only woman who had ever touched his guarded heart. That night, as storm clouds gathered over Whitmore Hall, Eleanor packed her few belongings with tears streaming down her face. She had fallen in love with a man whose very existence was built on her family's destruction. 3 weeks passed in agonizing separation. Eleanor returned to her family's cottage, carrying the weight of her broken heart alongside the terrible knowledge she now possessed. Her father's condition had worsened dramatically during her absence, and without the steady wages from Whitmore Hall, they faced complete destitution. The local physician refused further treatment without payment, and creditors circled like vultures. My darling girl, Thomas wheezed from his bed, his once strong hands now pale and trembling. You blame yourself for leaving your position, but you did what your conscience demanded. Honor matters more than comfort. I taught you that, didn't I? Eleanor clasped his frail fingers, fighting back tears. Even dying, her father sought to comfort her, rather than accept comfort for himself. Margaret Hartwell watched her daughter's suffering with a mother's keen insight. You loved him, she said one evening, as they sat by the meager fire. The Duke. I can see it in your eyes, the way you carry yourself like something precious has been broken inside you. Love him? Eleanor's voice was hollow. How can I love someone whose family destroyed ours? It would be the greatest betrayal of Papa's suffering. But even as she spoke these words, memories tormented her. Alexander's gentle touch, the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his aristocratic mask, the way he had looked at her, as if she were the answer to some profound loneliness. Meanwhile, at Whitmore Hall, Alexander was undergoing his own transformation. He had dismissed the corrupt estate manager within hours of Eleanor's departure and launched a comprehensive investigation into his father's business practices. The revelations were worse than he had feared. Dozens of families had suffered under the previous duke's greed, their complaints systematically ignored or suppressed. How you're destroying yourself over this guilt, his closest friend Lord Pemberton observed during a visit. Your father's sins aren't yours to bear, Alexander. You've already done more than most would to make amends. But Alexander barely heard him, consumed with planning restitution for every wronged family, starting with the Hartwells. He rode to their cottage one grey morning, his heart hammering as he dismounted outside the humble dwelling where Eleanor lived. She emerged before he could knock, her beauty undiminished despite the simple dress and worry lines around her eyes. Your Grace, she said formally, not meeting his gaze. "You shouldn't be here. It's not proper for someone of your station to—" "Propriety be damned," Alexander interrupted, his usual composure shattered. "Eleanor, I've come to offer your family full restitution, a proper house, medical care for your father, financial security for life. Not as charity, but as justice long overdue." He pulled documents from his coat. "I've also established a fund for all families harmed by my father's policies. What happened to you, to your father? It will never happen again." Eleanor studied his face, seeing genuine anguish there. "You think money can heal everything," she said softly, "but some wounds cut too deep for gold to touch. My father is dying, Your Grace. All the wealth in England can't give him back his strength, his dignity. The years of suffering your family cost him." "Then what would you have me do?" Alexander's voice broke. "How can I atone for sins I didn't commit but benefited from? How can I live with myself knowing that my comfort was bought with your family's pain?" The raw honesty in his words cracked something in Eleanor's carefully constructed armor. For the first time since discovering the truth, she really looked at him, saw the sleepless nights etched in his features, the weight of responsibility he carried, the genuine desire for redemption that drove him. "You truly didn't know," she realized aloud, "about the safety violations, the cover-up. You're as much a victim of your father's choices as we are." "Perhaps," Alexander said quietly, "but I'm the one with the power to change things now. Please, Eleanor, let me help your family properly, if not for my sake, then for your father's comfort in his final days." Eleanor closed her eyes, torn between pride and practicality, between her anger at his family and her growing understanding of his character. Eleanor's internal struggle ended when her father collapsed that very evening, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as pneumonia set in alongside his other ailments. The village physician, Dr. Matthews, arrived within the hour and delivered the grim verdict. Without immediate access to expensive medicines and proper nursing care, Thomas Hartwell had perhaps days left to live. "There's a specialist in London who might help," Dr. Matthews confided to Eleanor outside the cottage. "Dr. Harrison has had remarkable success treating similar cases, but the journey alone would be dangerous. And the costs—" He shook his head sympathetically. "I'm sorry, my dear. Your father is a good man. He deserves better than this." Eleanor stood in the cold night air, watching her breath form clouds in the moonlight. Every fiber of her being screamed against accepting help from the Whitmore family, yet her father's life hung in the balance. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, when each of his labored breaths might be among his last. She found Alexander at Whitmore Hall the next morning, waiting in his study as if he had known she would come. "My father is dying," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Dr. Matthews says there's a specialist in London who might help, but we cannot afford the journey or treatment." "Consider it done," Alexander replied immediately, already reaching for paper to write orders. "My fastest carriage, my personal physician to accompany you, the finest rooms at the Royal Hotel, whatever Dr. Harrison requires, all of it." He looked up at her with intense eyes. "I'll come with you if you'll permit it. Your father shouldn't face this battle alone, and neither should you." Eleanor wanted to refuse, to maintain the barrier she had erected between them, but exhaustion and fear overcame her pride. "Yes," she whispered, "please come with us." The journey to London was harrowing. Thomas Hartwell grew weaker with each mile, and several times Eleanor feared they would lose him before reaching the capital. But Alexander's presence proved unexpectedly comforting. He held vigil beside the carriage seat where her father lay, speaking in low, soothing tones about estate matters and village news, anything to keep Thomas conscious and fighting. Dr. Harrison, a distinguished physician with silver hair and kind eyes, examined Thomas thoroughly upon their arrival. His verdict was cautiously optimistic. The lung damage was extensive, but with aggressive treatment and several weeks of recovery, there was hope. "He's a fighter, this one," the doctor told Eleanor, "but he'll need constant care, and the medicines are indeed costly." "Money is no object," Alexander said firmly. "Whatever Mr. Hartwell needs, provide it." As days turned into weeks at the London hospital, Eleanor and Alexander found themselves thrown together in the intimate space of shared worry and hope. The barriers between them began to crumble as they took turns sitting beside Thomas's bed, sharing meals in the hospital's modest dining room, walking together through nearby gardens during brief respites from the sick room. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat in the hospital corridor, both exhausted from another long day. You've done more than enough to assuage any guilt over your father's actions. You owe us nothing more." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the lamplight. "At first it was guilt," he admitted, "but now, Eleanor, surely you must know. These weeks, watching you care for your father with such devotion, seeing your strength in the face of fear, I've fallen completely in love with you." Eleanor's heart stopped. The words she had longed to hear and dreaded in equal measure hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she dared cross. "Alexander," she breathed, using his given name for the first time, "we come from different worlds. The gap between us is nothing but convention and old prejudices," he interrupted passionately. "What does rank matter when measured against what we feel? Eleanor, I would give up everything, the title, the estates, the wealth, to spend my life with you." Before she could respond, a commotion from her father's room sent them both rushing inside. Thomas Hartwell was awake for the first time in 3 days, his eyes clear and alert as he gazed around the hospital room. "Ellie?" he called weakly, his voice hoarse but stronger than it had been in weeks. "Where are we, my dear?" "Papa!" Eleanor rushed to his bedside, grasping his hand as tears of relief streamed down her face. "We're in London. You've been very ill, but Dr. Harrison says you're going to recover." She helped him sit up slightly, noting with joy that his breathing seemed easier, less labored. Thomas's gaze moved to Alexander, who stood respectfully near the foot of the bed. Recognition flickered in the older man's eyes, followed by something like resignation. "Your Grace," he said formally, attempting to incline his head in a bow despite his weakened state. "I understand you've shown my family great kindness in our hour of need." "Mr. Hartwell," Alexander stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. My father's negligence caused your suffering, and I—" "Stop," Thomas interrupted gently but firmly. "I know what happened, son. Eleanor told me about the hidden correspondence, the deliberate neglect, but I also know that you've spent years trying to right your father's wrongs." He squeezed Eleanor's hand, noting how she watched the Duke with barely concealed love. "A man isn't responsible for his father's sins, only for how he chooses to live his own life." Eleanor looked between the two most important men in her life, seeing understanding pass between them. "Papa, you should rest. Dr. Harrison says you need several more weeks of treatment before you'll be strong enough to travel home." "Home?" Thomas mused. "Yes, about that. Eleanor, my darling girl, what if our home was somewhere different? Somewhere you could be truly happy?" His knowing gaze moved to Alexander. "Your Grace, I believe you have something to ask my daughter." Eleanor's breath caught as Alexander moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of everything unsaid between them, "I know the circumstances that brought us together were tragic. I know the differences in our stations seem insurmountable, but I love you with every fiber of my being, and I cannot imagine a life without you in it." He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a simple but elegant ring, not the ostentatious Whitmore family jewels, but something clearly chosen with careful thought. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not the Duchess of Whitmore, but simply the woman I love beyond all reason?" Eleanor stared at the ring through tears, her heart full to bursting. "The scandal," she whispered. "Society will never accept a blacksmith's daughter as a duchess." "Then society can go to blazes," Alexander replied with fierce determination. "I've wasted too many years caring about the opinions of people who value bloodlines over character. You, Eleanor, are worth more than all their approval combined." Thomas Hartwell chuckled weakly from his bed. "Ellie, my dear, your mother and I didn't raise you to be a coward. If this good man loves you, and it's plain to see that he does, and if you love him in return, then the rest is just noise." Eleanor looked into Alexander's storm-grey eyes and saw her future there, not perfect or easy, but filled with genuine love and the promise of two people committed to building something beautiful together. "Yes," she breathed as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The kiss that followed was witnessed only by her father and the soft London rain against the window, but it sealed a promise that would reshape both their lives. Outside, the world might whisper and gossip about the Duke who married beneath his station, but inside that hospital room, 3 people who had learned that love could triumph over even the deepest injustices smiled through their tears and began planning for a future none of them had dared imagine just months before. 1 year later, Eleanor stood on the terrace of the renovated east wing of Whitmore Hall, watching her father tend the garden he had insisted on planting himself. Thomas Hartwell had made a remarkable recovery under Dr. Harrison's care, and though he would never again possess the strength of his blacksmith days, he had found new purpose in managing the estate's charitable foundation that Alexander had established in his name. The Hartwell Fund has approved applications from 6 more families this month, her father called out, wiping soil from his hands as he approached. That young widow in Millbrook will have her roof repaired before winter, and the Fletcher children will finally be able to attend proper school. His eyes twinkled with satisfaction. Who would have thought this old blacksmith would become a philanthropist in his twilight years? Eleanor smiled, adjusting the simple but elegant dress she wore, a far cry from the elaborate gowns expected of duchesses. But Alexander had insisted she dress to please herself rather than society. You were always generous with what little we had, Papa. Now you simply have more resources to match your heart. Speaking of generous hearts, Thomas nodded toward the courtyard where Alexander was speaking with a group of estate workers, listening intently to their concerns about working conditions. Your husband continues to surprise me. Not many men of his position would care so deeply about the welfare of their employees. Indeed, Alexander had transformed not just Whitmore Hall, but the entire estate system. Fair wages, safe working conditions, and worker compensation had become the standard, inspiring other noble families to follow suit. Some called him radical. Others whispered that marriage to a commoner had addled his senses. Alexander ignored them all, focused only on building the kind of legacy he and Eleanor could be proud of. "Eleanor," her mother called from the house, emerging with baby clothes draped over her arm. Margaret Hartwell had bloomed in her new role as companion to the Duchess, managing household affairs with the practical wisdom that came from years of making much from little. "These just arrived from London. Lady Pemberton sent them for the nursery, along with her congratulations." Eleanor placed a protective hand over her growing belly, still amazed by the miracle of the life she and Alexander had created together. The child would be born into privilege, yes, but also into a family that understood the value of compassion, hard work, and justice for all people regardless of their station. "Have you given more thought to names?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair beside his daughter. "Something tells me this little one will have quite a legacy to live up to." "We have," Eleanor replied with a soft smile. "If it's a daughter, we'll call her Hope, for she represents everything Alexander and I hope for the future. If it's a son, his name will be Thomas Alexander Whitmore, after the 2 finest men I've ever known." As if summoned by their conversation, Alexander appeared on the terrace, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw his wife. Even after a year of marriage, he still looked at her with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "The tenants' council meeting went well," he reported, settling beside Eleanor and taking her hand. "Young William Fletcher has some excellent ideas about crop rotation that could benefit everyone." "The same William Fletcher whose education the Hartwell Fund is supporting?" Eleanor asked with raised eyebrows. "The very same. Proves your father's wisdom in insisting that a good mind should never be wasted for lack of opportunity." Alexander's voice carried deep satisfaction. "We're building something real here, Eleanor. Something that will outlast us both." As the sun set over the Yorkshire countryside, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the 4 members of this unlikely family sat together in comfortable silence. The cottage where Eleanor had once counted their last coins still stood in the village below, now home to another struggling family who received it rent-free along with employment at the estate. "No regrets?" Alexander asked softly, following Eleanor's gaze toward the distant hills where their love story had begun with such pain and uncertainty. Eleanor turned to study his beloved face, seeing in it not the cold duke of local legend, but the man who had chosen love over convention, justice over tradition, hope over the bitter legacy of the past. "Only one," she replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I regret that it took a cliff's edge and near disaster to bring us together." "Ah, but what a beautiful disaster it was," Alexander murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple as their child stirred within her. "Some of the greatest love stories begin with the most impossible circumstances." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Whitmore Hall, Eleanor reflected that perhaps that was true. Perhaps the greatest gifts in life, love, redemption, hope, were always born from the darkest moments, when 2 hearts brave enough to look beyond their circumstances found each other and chose to build something beautiful together. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.